So much, Mauricio, and thank you all for joining me today. When Mauricio called me and invited me to speak about Jewish education, I said, how long do you have? It's an area that is complex and nuanced, and also that I'm incredibly passionate about, but I hope to share with you some thoughts from my own experience as both a consumer of Jewish education, as a parent who've had 3 sons go from nursery through beyond university in the Jewish education system in the States and in Israel, and also as a purveyor of Jewish education as a dean. I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully this will work. Yes? You see that, correct? Okay. And what I really would like to do is together today imagine and reimagine, inspire and challenge, and talk about how we joyfully move forward. We do a lot of kvetching in the Jewish world and in Jewish education. You know, there's the famous saying, it's hard to be a Yid, it's hard to be a Jew. But it also has to be, and Jewish education must be filled with joy and with simcha if we are going to have the kind of impact that we want to have on the next generation. I have to tell you by way of introduction a little bit about my journey. I am, as Mauricio shared, by training and for more decades than I will admit, a clinical psychologist who worked for years not in the Jewish education or even in the education field. As a clinical psychologist, I was a victim and a participant in the wait and see approach to children's growth and mental health. By that, I mean, I sat in an office, often at a medical center or a university hospital, and I waited until children's suffering or difficulties became so intense that they were then brought to my office for me to fix them. And we actually had a joke in one of the hospitals that I worked in, had a circular driveway, and we said parents would treat us like the local takeout fast food center. They would drop their child at one entrance, and then they would park and zoom around and come back and want to pick them up fixed. That, of course, is a myth. Clinical psychologists cannot do that. We don't fix children, and certainly not in the time it takes to circle a parking lot. And what I quickly discovered was that one of the most potent influencers in children's lives was school. And that while I might work with a child for 40 minutes in a week, working on their social skills or working on their anger management, I then had to send them off to a place where they were spending countless hours of every day with educators who had, in many ways, much more influence than I would ever have. And so I began to shift my focus from wait and see to go and help, from there's a problem that needs to be fixed to how do we create an environment that actually alleviates, avoids, and ameliorates problems. At the same time, I have to say that I was growing as a Jewish learner. My own commitment to Jewish learning and to Jewish practice grew as my children benefited from Jewish education and stretched my husband and my horizons. We often look back and say, when we got married, did we think we would have the home, the shelves of Jewish books, and would we devote our time and energies to the causes and to the learning that we do now? And really, I have to credit a lot of our growing commitment. We were always Orthodox observant Jews, but we really developed a deepening respect for Jewish learning and better engagement as our children grew. And the other piece is that I was, for many, many years, a parent and a consumer. Now I'm a grandparent consumer of Jewish education and have the opportunity sometimes to literally visit a school where a colleague or an alumni that I've taught is now the principal of my 6-year-old granddaughter. And as a parent and a consumer, I've had to struggle with all that I've seen that schools can be and should be, and sometimes are not, and sometimes are very far from what they should be or could be. And I have to say that what I'm going to share with you in my view of Jewish education and where we are and where we can go has been so influenced by my journey that I encourage you to really think about how your own journey influences and continues to influence your view of what Jewish education can and should be. My visions and passions are, they're extraordinary, not for, their uniqueness, but I'm incredibly grandiose. When people ask me, what are you doing, a clinical psychologist? Being the dean of a graduate school of Jewish education, I have no background in Jewish education from an academic point of view. I'm a psychologist. I have no background in pedagogy or the science of curriculum design. What am I doing? I say, well, because I don't sleep at night and I won't sleep at night until every Jewish child has an extraordinary Jewish education, not an acceptable, not a passable, not, well, they have something. I want everyone to have access to extraordinary Jewish education. And to do that, I have to think about schools and educators and students, and to some extent, families as well. So for schools, I dream of a time when we integrate Jewishness in the fabric of our schools, regardless of whether we're teaching science or math or history. One of the things that I experienced for the decades that I worked in the mental health world, and interestingly, all but one hospital I worked in had something Jewish in its name. Long Island Jewish Medical Center, Beth Israel Medical Center. But my Jewishness could have no place in my work. I could not integrate my Jewishness into my therapy work. I couldn't integrate my Jewishness into my teaching of students. It was asur, it was forbidden. It was not part of the curriculum. Even though psychology and mental health began to wake up to the value of faith and faith-based approaches, it had to be ecumenical. I couldn't celebrate Jewish values and Jewish ways of doing things over any other religious or spiritual understanding. When I was recruited 13 years ago to come to Yeshiva University, within the first interview, I realized this is the first time in my professional life that I can integrate my whole self into my work. That I do not have to, quietly figure out how I integrate Shabbat into my intense work in a clinical setting, that Shabbat and preparing for the Jewish holidays is going to be taken into account in the calendar. And I don't have to turn off my Jewishness when I teach, even if I'm teaching about families, about research, about what we would think of as secular topics. I can do so through a Jewish lens. My other visions and passions for schools are to really think of schools as a source of growth and health. I yesterday videotaped Isaac's getting a view in advance. I videotaped my comments for graduation. And one of the things I said is that people think that education and schools are places of knowing, but they are not. They should be places of growing. And if we're not growing people in our schools, then we're doing something wrong. Then our soil has the wrong nutrients in it. Then we're not getting enough sunlight or rain. We really need to think about how can we be agents of growth, and to do that, we have to focus on the whole child. We can't grow their heads without growing their souls. We can't grow their hearts without growing their minds, and we can't grow them as plants that live alone. There's recent research, it's quite amazing, on how trees communicate with each other through their root systems. we have to grow our, Rob Nebenzahl talks about, Rav Shapiro, Kalanimus Shapiro, in his amazing work, Chovas HaTalmidim, a guide for the student. He talks about every student, every Jewish child has the potential to be the towering cedar of Lebanon. We can't grow the towering cedars of the next generation by only focusing on their roots or only on their branches. We have to focus on all of them. But it's not just what schools do. Now we have to say I'm going to talk more about all of these. What about educators? For educators, we need to focus on respect, on kavod, on reflection, and on a broad sense of responsibility. And again, I'll talk more about this later. And for students, we need to think about our schools as places that involve and invite and generate awe and wonder, that allow for active engagement, for student voice, and for relevance to their world and to their lives. Now let's break this down a little bit. For all, whether we're talking about schools or students or educators, we have to realize that the picture is complex. And if we want to do our job fully, we have to engage all 4 spheres of development: the social, the emotional, the cognitive, and the spiritual. In this incredibly challenging year, we have learned and we have seen what happens when we lose one sphere. I don't know what things are like in Mexico, but every conversation I've had with my students, my alumni, with school guidance counselors is particularly about how we've lost the social. Even though we may be together in Zoom, where's the schmooze time? Where's the catching people? Someone needs to mute themselves, please. Where do we find the time to build connections from students to teachers, from students to students, the colleagues who are themselves? My colleagues who are teachers say, I really miss the faculty room. I miss those informal moments where I can turn to a colleague and say, that was great, or that was hard. What do you think about that? This is a picture of the traditional view of schools. This is what many people have in their head when they think about schools and Jewish education. Etzba al hamakom, put your finger on the place, sing out the parsha, boys and girls sitting. By the way, all of the pictures I picked, the students look quite engaged, don't they? It looks like they're active. I didn't pick any horrible classroom pictures, but we have to ask ourselves the question, is this doing all that we want? And does this work for today's students? Today's students, we have to think about, on all of these levels, what is it that they're looking for and what is it that they need? And again, I'm going to allude to this I'm trying to think of what's the English translation of Chovas HaTalmidim, guideline for the student. It's not guidelines, it's translated differently, but it's available in English. I don't know that it's available in Spanish. The first 10 pages, although it's a guide for students, the first 10, 15 pages is really written to educators. And I actually think they're the most brilliant 15 pages about education that have probably ever been written. They were written by Rav Shapiro in the Warsaw Ghetto in the 1930s. And he writes so eloquently about, we cannot assume that what learning worked for us works for today's children. 1930s, he was saying the minds, the hearts, the souls of children are different than they were 10, 15, 25 years ago. And woe be to us, he says, if we blame them for our failure to adjust, if our education falls flat, if we are not reaching our goals. It is not because there's something wrong with them. It's because we have failed to evolve. It is very popular in the field of education now to talk about 21st century learning and to talk about how different the needs of today's thinker, today's student are than of students in the past. Whoops, went too fast. That unlike the prior years where successful students just needed to house a lot of information, in our data accessible world, what we need in 21st century skills are critical thinkers, communicators, collaborators, and creators, the entrepreneurs of the future who can do things that machines can't yet do. Simply knowing stuff, just ask Siri. Ask Google. Google knows more than any student you'll ever have. And it's, Google is available to us everywhere. So we don't need to be masters of knowledge. We need to be masters of critical thinking and communication, etc. And 21st century learner needs to be literate, not just in the digital world, but in communication, literate in terms of their understanding of social responsibility, of problem solving, collaboration, literate and have mastery skills of self-direction and personal management. So when we think about our schools, it doesn't work to say, well, we do math from 9 to 10, and then we do English. When are we doing this? We have to think about within and throughout our school, how are we adding these new dimensions? And I think that the way that we do that, I'm sorry, sometimes I hit the wrong button. The way that we do that is we have to think about the changes we've already made and the changes that are needed in everything from our learning goals, which includes what we teach, to how we teach and the pace of our teaching. Now, I know, by the way, that anyone who teaches in Jewish settings, in dual curriculum settings, is saying, okay, Novick, like we can't do more. There aren't enough hours in the day. And I think about what I call double dipping, that every decision we make about what we teach, how we teach, etc., we should be asking, how am I getting two birds with one stone? I don't know if this translates into Spanish, it's an English expression. How am I using this 10 minutes of teaching of Parshat HaShavua or of this lesson in math to also teach Ben Adam Lechavero, to teach the social values of how do I treat my fellow man? There's no reason, by the way, that we have to add 2 apples and 2 apples to make 4 apples. We can take that exact same problem and say, you have 2 apples and Joey has 2 apples and there are 4 people in the room. How are you going to add up your apples so that everybody can have one? Is there enough for everyone? We can add a layer within our teaching that allows us to do more than one thing at a time. The social student, turning our attention now to the students and how they've changed, the social student in 2021, we have to recognize that this student has just experienced a year of in-person isolation. It may be for teens, by the way, that they've lived through this. They have had the opportunity to Snapchat and Instagram with all of their friends. But think, for example, I got a call from a preschool educator asking if I would work with a child who is selectively mute, who has not spoken, we're now in May, has not said a word in an entire year of preschool. The child is 3 years old. I agreed to consult with the parents and I asked the stupidest question. I asked the parent of this 3-year-old, a year into COVID, well, how is she on play dates? And the mother said she's never had a play date. Because when she turned old enough to have play dates, COVID hit. And she has been sequestered and they can't get together in lockdown with other families. And the next sibling she has is 10 years her senior. So here is a child who's never had the social opportunity to practice how to play with others her own age. And in preschool is overwhelmed and is literally voiceless. But even for teenagers and older children who have had vehicles to connect, they have had isolation for the whole year. That may mean that their social skills are not developmentally where they should be. They're rusty. Their conversation skills, their competition and ability to share, all of that is going to need work. And before COVID, we already had a problem with the large interactions through technology, we're eliminating people's ability to have face-to-face conversations and interactions. Social media has drastically changed adolescent and child relationships and social conventions. It is our role in schools to teach relevant social skills, to provide social opportunities. I tell this story all the time. I'm a graduate school dean. I am the person who decides whether you get admitted to graduate school or not. And I get emails that begin, "Hey, Doc, DOC, can you, letter U, send app for Doc Prague?" Now, if you can't write a sentence in English to the dean of a graduate school, I don't have great confidence in your ability to write a dissertation, and I'm not going to look so favorably on your application. And quite frankly, a potential employer is going to think the same way. So we need in our schools to be teaching how we grow and exist as social beings, even in a world that relies so heavily on technological connection and communication. The emotional student in 2021, there is endless evidence that the rates of anxiety are elevated this year. It is not a new change. It's just building on an ongoing increase. And quite frankly, anxiety has, for the past decade, been the #1 child mental health challenge in the world. There, by the way, are lack of sufficient resources for mental health treatment. So the latest statistics suggest that 1 in every 3 children who need mental health services receive them. That means 2 in 3 do not. And that's even in areas that, like New York, where I live, that are resource rich. Imagine if you live in a remote area in Mexico or in the US. Attentional challenges are prevalent. Some of them reach the level of a diagnosable disorder, but some are simply the fact that we are dealing with a generation that is used to Sesame Street education, video game interactions. I have 10 seconds and then it's a new level. And they expect our classroom lessons to be as full of pop and engagement as those outlets are. We know that social media increases the access to both information and misinformation about mental wellness. And so we will have our students telling us, well, I heard the best way for me to deal with my test anxiety is not to study, because I read somewhere on the web that that's the best thing, or that I should read this chapter 72 times and that will get me an A on the test. It's wrong. We know that the most promise comes from approaches that prevent, that imbue our classrooms with the precepts of positive psychology, that teach our students the routes to happiness, the ways to be mindful, the ways to include gratitude in their lives, the ways to make meaning and to be generous and to give. We know that including all of those in our school day and in our lessons will make for healthier, stronger students. And what about the spiritual student in 2021? This is just from one very well-known theory on the spiritual development of children, about the different stages and phases of spiritual development. And we're not going to go into that at all, but recognize that as Jewish educators in faith-based settings, we cannot simply expect spiritual development to happen without nurturing it and cultivating it and thinking about what is the best way that it grows. And we have to recognize, if you note particularly the adolescent, the questions, values, and religious beliefs, that questioning is a critical part of spiritual development. And thinking in our schools how we create a place that invites spiritual questioning and religious exploration while still being true to our traditions and our Torah heritage It's a huge challenge, but it's so important. Jay Goldmans, the prior head of school of Ramaz High School and a frequent writer on adolescent spirituality, says that adolescents, teens are much more concerned about your willingness to hear their question than your ability to answer it. You don't need, I mean, what a hard week it's been. Meron, Mexico City tragedy, COVID. This is not an easy year to answer children's and teens' spiritual questions, but we don't have to answer it. I love the phrase wrestling with God, wrestling with spiritual challenges. And it's all right to share the fact that we're struggling too, that we don't have the answers. Let's read together. Let's find what Rabbi Lord Sachs had to say about tragedy. Let's read what the Baal Shem Tov had to say. Let's read what the Hasidic Rebbe or Chazal or the Talmud or secular psychologists have to say. And let's then think about it and share it together. We don't have to have the answers. Some of the data, we've already talked about the fact that suffering in the world prompts questions about whether there is a God and what his role is. The work of Lisa Miller out of Columbia, her book that's for the non-professional public called The Spiritual Child is wonderful. I highly recommend it. Her many articles on this subject make it very clear that spirituality is insulation from life's stresses and strains. Spiritual adolescents are more than half, they're 60% less likely to be severely depressed. And the spiritual teen is not an outlier. 84% in a US study, broad study across the US, 84% of adolescents believe in God. Again, I'm quoting Rav Shapira because I just like his writings a lot. He writes, when the word chinuch, Jewish education is chinuch, is used, it means to nurture the inherent character and talents that lay dormant within the child. And since the spirit of Hashem, the spirit of God, lies concealed within the soul of every Jew, it is our responsibility to raise and teach him to discover it, to extract it, and to cause it to flourish. Again, you may say, I teach math, I teach science. You know what? Math and science, to me, are amazing subjects to teach awe, to teach wonder, to teach astonishment. What our world has discovered, what a Fibonacci sequence tells us, what a number game, or puzzle allows us to process. It's just extraordinary. And that, when I talk about spirituality, I'm not just talking about, take out the sefer and learn the text, but I'm talking about how do we connect spirituality to every aspect of what we do. Okay, moving now from students for educators. And I said I would talk more about what do I mean by kavod and respect. So I think yesterday was Teacher Appreciation Day. Chaval, it's unfortunate that we only have a day. Every single day should be Teacher Appreciation Day, every moment, every year. I don't know how to fix it, but it breaks my heart that Jewish educators and educators in general are not respected, and that respect doesn't translate into pay in accordance with what they deserve. You have, in Jewish educators, the most important employment that this world can have. There is nothing more precious as a natural resource than our children. But I think that Jewish, and I will work tirelessly to increase the respect that Jewish educators get, to increase the salary that Jewish educators get, to create an understanding in our communities and beyond that this is a profession of great respect. I say that I'll know my job is done when Jewish mothers and fathers brag around their Shabbat table, my son, the 5th grade teacher, my daughter, the high school Mora. The same way they say, my son, the doctor, my daughter, the lawyer. And until we get there, our work is not done. But it's not a one-way street. Educators also have to earn that respect. I'm sure it's no one here today because you're giving your time to be here. By definition, you're committed educators. But we have all met educators who treat it as if it's an hourly job. I punch in at 8 and I punch out at 3. And if it's not in my classroom, I don't deal with it. A teacher who walks in the hallway, students talk to her or him and doesn't give them the time of day. Those teachers are not deserving of our respect. And quite frankly, I wish that we had such a well planted garden of growing Jewish educators that we could cut those off and say, we don't need you in the garden. You're weeds. We're pulling you out. We're only leaving the flowers. But unfortunately, there's such a shortage of you that schools hire even those who do not act in ways that deserve and that earn their respect. But the other piece of the two-way street is that Jewish educators deliver respect. How they treat their students is so important because Jewish educators, particularly those who wear a kippah, who wear a sheitel, who are clearly identified as Jewish in a Jewish school, you are not just a teacher, you're an exemplar, you are a role model. And therefore, you giving respect to all of the students in the classroom, you turning to the weakest student or to the student who doesn't fit the norm and treating them with genuine care and respect makes you the best example of Torah living that a student will learn. Rabbi Abraham Yoshua Herschel writes that our Jewish students do not need textbooks, they need text people. We are the best text, and giving respect to others makes you the perfect model of Ben Adam Lechavero, of how we treat fellow man according to the Torah. Educators also, I was asked when I came to Azrieli, what in a teacher development program, what I think is the number one skill I would want every teacher to have. And I said, reflective practice. Reflective practice simply means that I'm going to look at my work on a regular basis, and I'm going to examine it for what worked and what didn't, for what went well and what could go better. And I'm going to constantly evolve that work. I once visited a classroom and a teacher showed me a binder filled with laminated sheets of all of her teaching. She said, I developed these 5 years ago, and now I have everything done. And I was thinking, oy vavoy, oy veismir. This is not what I call good educating, because what about if your students have a question? And over the months in observing her class, I saw time and time again, she taught Parsha, and the students would have a question on the Parsha, and she would say, that's not on the sheet, girls. Let's stick with the sheet. And all of their unbelievable questions, because they weren't in her binder that she made 5 years ago, never got addressed. Lahavdil, in complete contrast, I visited the classroom of a neophyte teacher who was very anxious and very nervous, also in a girls' school, middle school, also teaching either Chumash or Parsha, I don't remember. And a question came up about why, I remember distinctly, why did God drown the horses with the Mitzrayim in the crossing of the Red Sea? Why animals were being punished? What did the animals do? They're animals. They're hooked up to the chariots, and the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, are whipping them to go forward. It's not their fault. What kind of Hashem is this? What kind of God that drowns innocent animals? And the teacher, without missing a beat, said, that's an amazing question. You know, didn't someone have a question also in another parsha about an animal that gets hurt? Maybe it was Balaam's ass, donkey. I don't remember. Some other parsha. You know, I don't have the answer to that, but I'm going to go home tonight. I'm going to ask my husband, who's a Rebbe, and why don't you go home tonight, girls, and you ask your parents and see if they have an idea, or ask your Rebbe. And let's talk about this some more tomorrow. That's a really good question. What a difference in those two classrooms, in what students learned about not just questioning and that questions are okay, but the teacher modeled for them that it's okay not to have the answer, and that part of being a lifelong learner and a reflective learner is saying, I don't know, but I'll go look. And the last piece that educators of 2021 need to do, is to think about their responsibility for every learner in the room. Not just the A students, not just the high track, and not just the low track, but that everybody's learning. And this goes together with reflection, so that at the end of a lesson, at the end of a unit, at the end of a conversation, that I say, you know, Yossi seemed really disengaged. I wonder how I could better engage him. Rather than saying, Yossi seemed very disengaged, let me call the school psychologist. That's what a colleague of mine once labeled the tissue response. Why the tissue response? Because you pull the tissue out of the box. It's not mine anymore. Here, give the tissue to the school psychologist, give the tissue to the vice principal, give the tissue to the guidance department. She said the issue with the tissue response is that, you know what happens when you pull a tissue out of a box? Another one pops up. Unless you as an educator understand that every tissue in that box is mine, you're just going to keep on pulling students out of your arena of responsibility, when really the whole class is your responsibility. And for schools. So I've already talked about integrating Jewishness. I think the challenge here is that we are living in a time that has put enormous value on universalism, on everything has to be okay, and on, you know, social and moral and value equivalency. Every culture is fine. Every way of living is equally fine. This is the concept of, you know, they used to talk about the United States as a melting pot. Melting pot is not respecting of the cultural heritage that people bring. It says we're going to smelt you all down and make you into a new alloy, versus a quilt that says each square has integrity and brings its own vibrant color and pattern to the larger whole. It's interesting that Rabbi Norman Lamm Zatzal, the prior chancellor of Yeshiva University and a prolific writer, in his writing in the 1970s about Jewish education, wrote with unbelievable foresight that the emergence of the Black rights movement was extremely helpful to Jewish education. Why? Because he said it challenged this notion of melting pot. And it said our Black culture needs to have a place in schools. It needs to be celebrated. Do not try to make all of us vanilla, no, you know, pun intended in terms of changing colors, but accept us and our culture for who we are. And his argument is that in a world where Black Lives Matter, where we are talking about accepting difference and not melting everyone together, we actually have an opportunity to say to our students and in our schools, Jewishness has value too. The Jewish way has rich, unique attributes that will enrich the world, and you don't need to hide it, and you don't need to blend in. Obviously, you know, culturally there are all kinds of needs, but in our Jewish school, we can celebrate that Jewishness can be unique and can be different. I've already talked about schools as places of growth. I just want to mention that for certain students, if we don't do it right, schools are actually toxic. They are actually agents of harm. And I think we need to think really carefully about how we create schools where nobody, receives toxicity. And again, sometimes that means saying goodbye to teachers. I'm thinking of one school that came to me with a dilemma. There was an educator beloved by parents, beloved because every year the classroom would be lavishly decorated with a theme. Every year, every week, the teacher would send home an elaborate newsletter reporting on everything that teacher had done in the week with the class. Every month, the teacher would send an array of pictures that the teacher took of activities engaged in with that he engaged in with the students. There was just one problem. The teacher was toxic to one gender in his classroom. That gender never had a chance to speak, was never called on. I observed a teacher for the year. Girls were not called on. That teacher did special activities for boys only within class time, and girls were given seat work. The teacher also would find often in a year 1 or 2 students that were scapegoated and that were given belittling names that they were called throughout the year by the teacher. I said to the school, this teacher is toxic. You cannot renew the teacher's contract. You have to part company. Yes, but look at the classroom, look at the newsletter. Look. You can't detoxify what this has done to 2, 3, 25 students every year. You can't take that risk. And I've already talked extensively about how do we grow human beings in all directions? How do we grow children? So I want to end here and leave time for your questions and comments and maybe some conversation, with just to say thank you so much for joining me. You have such an amazing opportunity, but we also in Jewish education, I see this as a chiyuv. We have an incredible obligation. Pirkei Avot, the sayings of the fathers, remind us that we are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are we free to desist from it. We have come so far in Jewish education, but we're not done. We have plenty more to go. And the work and the engagement and the commitment of people like you is clearly part of the solution. So thank you.